Good evening. I'm Joshua David, President and CEO of World Monuments Fund. Welcome to our annual Paul Mellon Lecture. We are thrilled to have the Right Honorable John Julius Viscount Norwich here tonight to enthrall us with stories from his new book, Sicily, an Island at the Crossroads of History. Lord Norwich's enthusiasm for knowledge has led him to tackle everything from the histories of Byzantium and Venice to the histories of the popes and of historic houses in England. Lord Norwich has been a friend and a great supporter of World Monuments Fund almost since the beginning, becoming aware of our work right after the horrible floods that threatened Venice's rich cultural heritage in 1966. During the years since, he was the chairman of our affiliate in Britain, an honorary chairman of World Monuments Fund, and recipient of our 2005 Hadrian Award. He has lectured for us and traveled with us to see firsthand our work in Cambodia, Turkey, Spain, France, and, of course, Italy. We thank Lord Norwich for his unfailing support and for remaining a champion of our work. And now I'm pleased to introduce you to Lord Norwich.
Thank you very much. One or two little important preparations before we start. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I cannot tell you what a joy it is for me to be back here in New York and back here in the Morgan Library. It's quite a long time since I've been away. And it's wonderful to be back here, and of course, a great honor to be asked to speak to you this evening about Sicily. Sicily, said Goethe, is the key to everything. Nobody quite knew what he meant, which was frequently the way with Goethe. But what we do know is, first of all, it's the largest island in the Mediterranean. It's the stepping stone between Europe and Africa. It's the gateway between East and West, the link between the Latin world and the Greek. And it's been fought over and occupied in turn by almost every major nation in Europe, the Phoenicians and the Greeks, the Carthaginians and the Romans, the Goths and the Byzantines, the Arabs and the Normans, the Germans, the Spaniards and the French. They've all left their mark. It's belonged to them all. But the sheer number and variety of its masters have prevented it, it always seems to me, from developing any strong national identity of its own. I mean, with a heritage so kaleidoscopic, how could it? Even today, in spite of the beauty of its landscape, the fertility of its fields, and the perpetual benediction of its climate, one's somehow conscious always of some dark, brooding quality, of which poverty, the church, the Mafia, and all the other modern scapegoats may be symptoms, but are certainly not the fundamental cause. And now, a century and a half after being incorporated into her Italian home, Sicily is probably happier than she has been for many centuries. But though no longer lost, she always seems to me to be still lonely, seeking always an identity of her own that she can never entirely find. Now, Sicilian history is always either astonishingly full or ridiculously empty. I've just listed no fewer than 11 different conquerors, which certainly suggests a good deal of activity. At the same time, since the end of the 12th century, the island has never, ever belonged to itself. It's always belonged to someone else. And it seems to me to be a fact of history that when countries lose their independence, they tend to become strangely inactive. Thus, for more than 400 years, between roughly 1300 and 1700, The island was a colony of Spain. And you're not going to believe this. For all those 4 centuries in Sicily, virtually nothing happened. Every 10 or 20 years, they changed the viceroy. There was a dramatic earthquake in 1693. For the rest, the aristocracy got a bit richer, the peasantry remained just about the poorest in Europe. But nobody actually did anything. Nobody started a new industry or built a new road or did anything really useful. The whole island existed in a sort of state of suspended animation. But still, Sicilian history is about 3,000 years long, and there's obviously not time to talk about all of it now. So I'm going to confine myself to just 4 chapters. First, antiquity, then the Normans, then the Spanish Bourbons, and finally, the Risorgimento. And from the Risorgimento, we get a little way away from Sicily for a bit, but I'm afraid that's inevitable. If you want to know what happened in the spaces in between, well, there's a dazzlingly good book just published, and I shall be happy to sign copies at no additional charge. The first of the early Sicilian peoples in whom I can take a real interest, I don't go for prehistory, I can't deal with it, are the Greeks, who reached the island in the middle of the 8th century BC. They introduced the olive and the vine and rapidly built up a flourishing community, which soon became one of the cultural centers of the civilized world. The home of poets like Stesichorus of Hymera. He was the one, you remember, who the gods struck blind for composing invectives against Helen of Troy. Or philosophers, such as the great Empedocles of Acragas, now Agrigento, who did much valuable work on the transmigration of souls and relinquished his mortal clay one morning in 440 BC when another branch of scientific inquiry led him a little too far into the crater of Mount Etna. By this time, by the 5th century, the Greeks had colonized and civilized most of the eastern Mediterranean. And one consequence of this is that there are as many superb Greek sites in Sicily, Italy, and Asia Minor as there are in Greece. Many of them inevitably have been lost, yet in Sicily alone, at Selinunte here, where admittedly there have been extensive restorations, there are at least 7 temples of the 6th and 5th centuries, which are now in tolerable states of preservation. Or there's Segesta, the loveliest of all for me, set in a fold in the hills, an easy drive from Palermo, and it's surely everything a late 5th century Doric temple should be. The 9 temples at Agrigento, 5 are more impressive still, and particularly at sunset, quite astonishingly beautiful. And then, surprise, surprise, then there's Syracuse Cathedral. That splendid Baroque facade gives no hint of what lies within, but the interior tells a very different story. Those columns supporting the building are those of the original Greek temple of Athena, erected by the tyrant Gelon to celebrate his victory over Carthage in 480 BC, and famous for its magnificence all over the ancient world. The Byzantines converted it into a Christian church. The Arabs turned it into a mosque. Normans and Spaniards made their own contributions. A series of earthquakes did their worst. But those ancient columns have survived everything and still stand to prove once again that most fascinating of historical religious phenomena, that once a place is recognized as holy, then, regardless of all changes in the prevailing faith, holy it remains. And who, you may ask, was this tyrant Gelon? Well, tyrants, these men who ruled their cities as virtual dictators, played a very large part in Greek Sicilian history. There was one particularly unpleasant one in Acragas called Phalaris, who greatly enjoyed eating babies and small children, and who possessed an enormous hollow bull made of bronze, in which he tended to roast all those who displeased him. Gelon, by contrast, transformed his adopted city of Syracuse into a powerful and prosperous city, by far the most important, on the whole island. But before long, there was another problem, almost literally on the horizon. Carthage, which occupied the site of modern Tunis. Now, Carthage was originally Phoenician, and the Phoenicians were above all merchant seafarers, so people who sailed to every corner of the Mediterranean and even beyond, establishing trading colonies in Sicily, the Balearic Islands, and along the shores of North Africa. They may even have crossed the English Channel in search of Cornish tin. And by the 5th century BC, by far the most important and influential of all the Phoenician settlements in the Mediterranean was Carthage. I can't show you a meaningful picture of it because there was virtually nothing left. The Romans were to raze it to the ground. But Carthage occupied the site of modern Tunis, which you see there. And people are always surprised when they look on the map to find, first of all, that Tunis is not south of Sicily, but almost due west. And second, that the distance between the two cities is barely 100 miles. It was hardly surprising, therefore, that from the very first, Carthage had her eye on Sicily. And in 409, the Carthaginians launched their own long-threatened invasion, finally taking over a good deal of the island. But it didn't last long, because meanwhile, another great new power had begun to make its presence felt. And that new power, I need hardly tell you, was Rome. So Sicily was sandwiched between Rome and Carthage, so that it inevitably became the principal battleground during the two savage wars that were fought between the two giants, known as the Punic Wars. The fighting was long and hard, the bloodshed was immense, but both wars were eventually won by Rome, and the net result of the defeat of the Carthaginians was that Sicily now found herself effectively a Roman province. Well, immediately, the Sicilians found themselves at a disadvantage. Speaking as they did Greek rather than Latin, they were treated by the Romans as second-class citizens, people who were expected to pay their taxes and do as they were told, which was basically to produce as much quantity as much corn as they could, most of which was sent straight to Rome. There are two outstanding monuments, however, which date from the late Roman period. One of them I'm keeping to the end, simply so as to have a really pretty picture to finish up with. The other is the remains of a huge villa just outside the modern town of Piazza Armerina. It was built in the first quarter of the 4th century. Of the actual structure, practically nothing is left standing, but what takes the breath away is the quantity and the quality of the superb floor mosaics, which cover some 3,500 square meters. The owner of this extraordinary property has never been identified. He was clearly a man of immense wealth and distinction. He may even have been an emperor. This is one of the many marvelous hunting scenes. This is another favorite of mine. There are countless of other scenes, too, of animal and marine life, of men working in the fields, of dancing and feasting, and the cultivation of the vine. And now, we've got no pictures for a minute or two, so I'm going to turn this thing off. Now, when Constantine the Great transferred the capital of his empire to Constantinople in 330 AD, it made little difference to Sicily, which remained an imperial province. Although at one moment it almost became a great deal more than that, because in the middle of the 7th century, the Emperor Constans II, understandably concerned for the fate of his western provinces under the whirlwind surge of Islam, took the immense decision to shift the whole balance of the empire westwards and to transfer the imperial capital to Syracuse. If it had remained there, all European history would have changed. But 5 years later, one of the palace officials, presumably in an uncontrollable fit of nostalgia, attacked the emperor in his bath and felled him with a soap dish. His successor returned to the Bosphorus, and Sicily was left in peace again for a couple of hundred years. But that peace was rudely broken in 827 AD, when the Byzantine governor, a certain Euphemius, was recalled to Constantinople after an unseemly elopement with a local nun. Had he obeyed the order to return, he would certainly have come to a distinctly sticky end. Instead, in self-defense, he rose in revolt and proclaimed himself emperor, appealing to the Arabs of North Africa for aid. They, of course, asked nothing better. They landed in strength, took no notice of Euphemius, who very soon came to a sticky end anyway, and 3 years later they stormed Palermo, making it their capital. Syracuse followed, and Sicily became, to all intents and purposes, part of the Muslim world. For the Greek Christian communities who remained, life continued pleasantly enough. The Arabs were very tolerant. They allowed the churches and the monasteries to flourish as they always had. But it was Islam that now reigned supreme. And it was now, with the Saracen conquest, that Sicily became one of the major trading centers of the Mediterranean, with Christian, Muslim, and Jewish merchants all thronging the bazaars of Palermo. And then the Normans arrived. And the Normans were out, quite frankly, for what they could get. As a race, they inclined to vast numbers of children, which resulted in equally vast numbers of footloose younger sons wandering south in search of land and adventure. And what better excuse for adventure was there than a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, which had the added advantage that they could stop off in Apulia at the centuries-old shrine of Monte Sant'Angelo, the Archangel Michael, who was also, of course, patron of their own Mont Saint-Michel. And it was there, one day in 1015, that a party of young Norman pilgrims returning from the east was accosted by a curiously dressed stranger. He was, he told them, a Lombard. His people had been in South Italy for 500 years, but most of the territory that had once been Lombard was now under Byzantine occupation. And it didn't need to be. With the help of a few hundred young Normans like themselves, those Byzantines could easily be sent packing, and the Lombards wouldn't forget their friends. So here for the Normans was the perfect opportunity, a rich, fertile land which they were being invited, implored almost, to enter, and which offered endless possibilities for making their fortune. And so the great southward migration began, not with a conquering army as in England, but with a steady stream of young men looking for trouble. Within less than half a century, the Normans had made themselves the most powerful force in South Italy. Not surprisingly, because they were led by a certain Robert Guiscard, the son of an obscure Norman baron who was to prove himself the most dazzling military adventurer between Julius Caesar and Napoleon. Pope Leo IX, understandably worried about this terrifying new power on his very doorstep, led an army against him, but was soundly defeated and taken prisoner. So soon afterwards, the papacy, unable to lick the Normans, joined them very sensibly. And Robert received a papal investiture as Duke of Apulia, Calabria, and Sicily. So here was another open invitation. And in 1061, just 5 years before the Battle of Hastings, he and his younger brother Roger invaded the island, and 11 years later, in 1072, they made their formal entry into Palermo. This is the Cathedral of Cefalù, about halfway along the north coast between Palermo and Messina, built in the 1140s. For me, it's one of the most sublime monuments of Norman Sicily. And it gets better, just wait till we go inside. But before we do that, let's have another look at that first generation of Normans. Robert soon returned to the mainland, never again to set foot in Sicily. It was his brother Roger, ruling with the title of Great Count, who began to forge this multiracial, multilingual, multiconfessional people into a nation. There were nowhere near enough of his Norman compatriots to dominate the island. The only hope was to win the confidence of everybody else, of the Greeks and the Arabs, and to persuade them all to cooperate in government. And this, incredibly, is what Roger and later his son, Roger II, did. Latin, Norman French, Greek, and Arabic were all made official languages of the state. The Greeks, who were by far the best seamen, were given control of the navy. The Arabs took over the treasury because their mathematics were always much better than anybody else's. Thus it was that for the first, and indeed the last time in European history, the three great civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Latin, the Greek, and the Arab, all came together in harmony and concord. And all this, be it noted, all this occurred less than 100 years after the great schism between the Greek and the Latin churches, and in the very century of the Second and Third Crusades, where just a few hundred miles to the east, Christians and Muslims were bashing each other's brains out. Only here, in this one island, in the dead center of the Mediterranean, was there peace, understanding, and mutual respect. Norman Sicily remains a lesson to us all. And this astonishing achievement was reflected in the art and architecture. In this little city of Cefalù, Roger II's cathedral, outwardly a simple southern Romanesque, contains a purely Byzantine mosaic of Christ Pantocrator, the ruler of all, which for me is the greatest portrait of the Redeemer in all Christian art. I've taken a good number of people to see it over the years, last time only 3 months ago, and I've seen them there standing in front of it with tears streaming down their faces. It dates from about 1145. Is there anywhere in the world a greater religious masterpiece than this, or a more compelling advertisement for Christianity? I don't think there is. Equally astonishing, in a very different way, is the Palatine Chapel in the Royal Palace at Palermo. The ground plan is purely Western. There's a central nave, side aisles, a few steps up to the chancel. No surprises here. But the walls are encrusted with Byzantine mosaics, finer than most of those you can find in Constantinople. That one's the pelican, the Christian symbol of charity, because it's said to feed its young with its own blood. Of course, it doesn't, but that's beside the point. And here, over another side aisle, is another one of my favorites, Noah's Ark. And finally, the roof. Surely the most unexpected covering of any Christian church on earth. A purely Arabic wooden stalactite ceiling in the classical Islamic style, as fine as anything to be found in Cairo or Damascus. And then there's the Greek church of the Martirana. Like Cefalù and the Palatine Chapel, it possesses 12th century Greek mosaics of heartbreaking beauty, but it also boasts one very special treasure, our one surviving portrait of King Roger II himself, a purely Byzantine figure in his long dalmatic stole, being symbolically crowned by Christ. And above his head, as you see, bold black letters stride across the gold to proclaim him in Greek letters, Rogerios Rex. Well, the last great monument of Norman Sicily is the work of Roger II's grandson, William II, called, without much reason, William the Good. His father was called William the Bad, and that was rather unfair as well. It's the Cathedral of Monreale, just outside Palermo. Its impact is chiefly due to its size and its splendor, the walls covered with over 1.5 acres of sumptuous mosaics, all created between 1183 and the end of the decade. And there's one mosaic in particular that must on no account be missed, the second figure to the right of the central east window. The inscribed name leaves no doubt of its identity, St. Thomas of Canterbury. And why is it here, dating from only a dozen years or so from the saint's death, because King William's queen, Joanna, was the daughter of King Henry II of England, here making her own personal atonement for her father's conduct. Well, the last miracle of Monreale is the cloister. Here's the only touch of Saracen architecture to be found there. Those slim Arabizing arches, 104 of them, supported on pairs of slender decorated columns, the capitals of which constitute a tour de force of Romanesque stone carving, unequaled in all the south. On one of them, we actually see a pair of Norman knights. In the past 2 centuries, they'd come a long way. Well, it's time now to fast forward. The Norman line died out. Duke Charles of Anjou took over. He was overturned in 1282 when the Sicilians rose up against him in the famous War of the Sicilian Vespers. The island then passed to King Peter of Aragon and was Spanish for those 4 utterly uneventful centuries that I mentioned earlier. At the Treaty of Utrecht in 1715, which effectively redrew the map of Europe, it was taken over first by the Duke of Savoy for a few years, then a few years later by the Austrian Emperor, and finally in 1733 by Spain again, after a large-scale invasion led by Don Carlos, the heir to the Spanish crown, who became King of Naples and Sicily, though unfortunately for us he tended to live in Naples rather than Sicily. But in the next quarter of a century, he absolutely transformed the city of Naples, making it one of the most magnificent capitals of Europe, and surrounding it with these huge hunting lodges like Capo di Monte or the vast palace of Caserta, which is almost as big as Versailles. But like his predecessors, he didn't do much for Sicily, which, with its brigandage and its lawlessness, its lack of communications, and its almost unbelievably primitive peasantry, was considered to be ungovernable and largely left to its own devices. Well, in 1759, the king, recalled to Madrid to become King Charles III of Spain, bestowed the kingdom of Naples on his 3rd son, Ferdinand, then aged 8. The trouble with Ferdinand was that he never really grew up. Although he lived to be 74 and to occupy the throne for 66 years, he remained all his life an overgrown schoolboy, and an unusually stupid one at that. He boasted that he had never read a book. He had no feelings of responsibility and very little conscience. He was interested only in hunting. When not in the saddle, he spent his time in the rough and boisterous horseplay that the average boy grows out of at the age of about 9. He never grew out of it at all. He married the 10th daughter of the Empress Maria Theresa, who had been brought up with her younger sister, the future Marie Antoinette of France. Though still only 17, Maria Carolina was imperious, arrogant, every inch a queen. Unlike her husband, though, she was also formidably intelligent. The wedding night seems to have left Ferdinand unmoved. He got up early, as usual, to go hunting, murmuring, "Dorme come una mazzata e sude come un porco." She sleeps as if she'd been murdered and she sweats like a pig. But eventually, the 2 of them grew fond of each other. And to her husband was always ein recht guter Narr, a right good fool. Then in 1764, when Ferdinand was 13, there had arrived a new British envoy in Naples, Sir William Hamilton. He was to hold the post for the next 36 years. His first wife died in 1782, whereupon he brought out to Naples the young Emma Hart, with her mother as chaperone. The 2 married only 9 years later, when Sir William was 60, Emma 26. With her beauty, her irresistible charm, and her performances of what she called her attitudes, this I assume to be one of them, she took the staid, unimaginative society of Naples by storm. Then, in September 1793, the British warship HMS Agamemnon dropped anchor in the harbour with dispatches for Sir William. Her commanding officer delivered them in person. The two had a brief conversation, after which Sir William summoned his wife. He was, he said, about to introduce her to a small man who might not be very handsome, but who, he believed, would one day astonish the world. And it's now that Captain Horatio Nelson, RN, enters the story. Nelson was now 35 and utterly exhausted. He'd set foot on shore only twice in the past 4 months, during which he and his crew had been without fresh meat, fruit, or vegetables. But he was greatly cheered by his reception at the palace, being invited to dinner and placed on the king's right. Since he spoke not a word of any foreign language, Emma interpreted. He probably fell in love with her then and there, because she was, after all, radiantly beautiful, and it was many weeks since he'd ever seen a woman. But he couldn't stay in Naples for long. Britain was now at war with revolutionary France. In the autumn of 1793, at the port of Toulon, the Republican army had defeated the French, Royalist, British, and Spanish forces, thanks largely to the brilliance of the 24-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte, who was going from strength to strength. And in 1798, Napoleon launched his immense Egyptian expedition. Before long, Nelson was in hot pursuit, and during the night of the 1st and 2nd of August, in Abu Qir Bay, just at one of the mouths of the Nile, in one of his most brilliant victories, he utterly destroyed the French fleet. 8 weeks later, he arrived back in Naples to a hero's welcome. But that again didn't last long, because the situation was deteriorating fast. The French army was now in Rome, on Naples' very doorstep. What was to prevent its crossing the frontier? And who was to prevent it if it did? It was clear that the royal family must leave at once for Sicily, for safety. And Nelson, now commanding HMS Vanguard, was ready to take them there. They left on the 23rd of December. The weather was atrocious. Nelson wrote that it blew harder than I have ever experienced at sea. Coming from Nelson, that's quite a testimonial. All the passengers were in a state of panic. Only Emma kept her head, winning the admiration of everybody. On Christmas Day, the little Prince Carlo Alberto, aged 6, died in her arms. Maria Carolina, not yet recovered from the news of her sister's execution 3 months before, was in despair. And Palermo, when they eventually docked in the harbour, provided little consolation. The royal palace, which they had never visited before, came as a nasty shock. Dark, dripping with damp, it hadn't been lived in for years. There were no fireplaces, no carpets, and the winter was the coldest on record. They had a perfectly dreadful time, but gradually, of course, spring came, and with it summer, and with summer, things gradually improved. There were balls and concerts and dinners, followed by cards. Emma was among the most reckless of the players. Nelson always beside her, though often half asleep. Visitors were shocked by him. One of them, Lady Elgin, wrote, "It's really humiliating to see poor Lord Nelson. He seems quite dying, and yet as if he had no other thought than her." He didn't. As soon as the crisis was past, at the end of 1799, Maria Carolina decided to pay a visit to Vienna to see her eldest daughter, now Empress, and the first 5 of her grandchildren. She insisted on taking Nelson and the Hamiltons with her, and they left her there. They went back to London, where they fade out of our story. Nelson returning to active service only just in time to save his reputation at the Battle of Copenhagen. King Ferdinand, meanwhile, returned to Naples, most reluctantly, because the hunting wasn't half as good as it was in Sicily. And his queen, Maria Carolina, joined him. But once again, their stay in the capital proved only temporary. In 805, Napoleon crowned himself King of Italy, and in January 1806, the royal couple had to flee once again to Palermo. And only just in time, because a few weeks later, Joseph Bonaparte was proclaimed King of Naples. Joseph I think we can see, was pretty dull. Being Napoleon's brother was just about his only distinction. But dullness could not be used to describe his successor, his brother-in-law, Joachim Murat, magnificently charismatic, who remained in Naples till Napoleon's final downfall. Only then could old Ferdinand safely return to his capital, where in January 1825 he died of a stroke just a week short of his 75th birthday. Well, there were three more Bourbon kings of Naples, now technically known as Naples and the Two Sicilies, all of them deeply unmemorable. And then came 1848, the Quarantotto, the year of revolutions. The first of them took place in Palermo on January the 12th. By the end of the year, there had been 11 others in Italy, one in Paris, and others in Vienna, Krakow, Warsaw, and Budapest. In Sicily, the revolt spread to all the main cities, and the then king, King Bomba, Ferdinand II, made the cardinal mistake of bombarding Palermo. He was to be known as King Bomba forevermore. Well, now why? Why were there all these revolutions? In the rest of Europe, of course, people wanted independence. They wanted the abolition of the old monarchies and the establishment of modern republics. In Italy, on the other hand, which was not yet one country, the call was for unification. And this unification had to be under the King of Piedmont, Victor Emmanuel II. Why Piedmont, you ask? This tiny state with its capital in Turin, right up in the Alps, in the extreme northwest corner of Italy. Because Piedmont was then the only free nation in the whole peninsula. Everywhere else was under French or Austrian or Spanish Bourbon control. The great architect of unification was its prime minister, Camillo Cavour, not terribly good-looking perhaps, with his pop eyes and his pebble glasses, but with a mind like a rapier. His first task was to get rid of Austria, which still ruled Venetia, Lombardy, and all the northeast of Italy, including Venice. And he did a deal with Napoleon III, who was only too pleased to help. The two got together, and the result was a very complicated treaty, which we don't need to bother about much, except to say that it involved, among many other things, the surrender of the city of Nice to France. Now, this agreement made one man very cross indeed, and he, unfortunately, was the greatest of all Italy's patriots, Giuseppe Garibaldi, who, having been born in Nice, now found himself a Frenchman. In 1860, Garibaldi was already 53, with nearly 40 years of revolutionary adventure, much of it in South America, behind him. And when on the 4th of April of that year there was another popular insurrection in Palermo, he instantly assembled a band of volunteers. The 1,000, they came to be called, though in fact there were 1,162 of them. And at dawn on the 6th of May, they embarked at Genoa for Sicily in 2 chartered steamships. They represented a broad cross-section of Italian society. About half were professional men, lawyers, doctors, engineers, even a few priests, and the other half came from the working classes. They arrived at Marsala on the 11th. 3 days later, Garibaldi formally assumed the dictatorship of the island in the name of King Victor Emmanuel and was cheered to the echo. On the following day, they advanced towards Palermo, and they were just a mile or two from the temple of Segesta, which we saw earlier, when they found the Bourbon army waiting for them. The battle was fought on the 15th of May and lasted several hours, most of the fighting being pretty nasty, hand-to-hand, with bayonets rather than muskets. Garibaldi's men were massively outnumbered, but he could count on one huge psychological advantage. The Bourbon troops had little stomach for the fight. To every Italian, on the other hand, Garibaldi's army of red shirts, with its whole string of victories in South America as well as in Italy, was by now of almost legendary fame. Its members were often credited by the peasantry with a magic invulnerability to bullets. They were also championing an ideal, the unification of Italy, in which they all passionately believed, under a leader whose extraordinary charisma was a constant inspiration. If the 1,000 could win this first battle, Garibaldi told them, there was a strong possibility that the opposition would melt away, and then, just in a week or two, they would be masters of the whole island. And he was right. The capital was still garrisoned by 21,000 Neapolitan troops, and Garibaldi advanced with great caution, taking a circuitous path through the mountains. But when, at dawn on the 26th of May, he entered the suburbs of Palermo, he found, to his astonishment, that there was no opposition at all. He was even more surprised to be greeted by a correspondent from the London Times, which he discovered had been devoting daily articles to his progress. For by now, his expedition had caught the imagination of the world. In England especially, the excitement was increasing day by day. Appeals for funds were launched. Charles Dickens and Florence Nightingale were among the contributors. In America, the New York Times compared Garibaldi to Washington, while the New York Daily Tribune published a blistering attack on the Bourbons by the paper's London correspondent, Karl Marx. In Russia, interest was not confined to the intelligentsia of Moscow and St. Petersburg. The Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, who was at that time in exile in Siberia, reported that the March of the 1,000 was being followed with passionate interest in Irkutsk. On the morning of the 30th, the general commanding the Neapolitan forces invited Garibaldi to a meeting on a British warship, and the two agreed on an immediate ceasefire. A fortnight later, not a single Neapolitan soldier was left in Palermo. In little over a month, a handful of poorly armed and largely untrained men had brought one of the greatest royal houses of Europe to its knees. But there was trouble ahead. On the 1st of August, Cavour wrote to a colleague, "If Garibaldi can pass to the mainland and take possession of Naples, as he has of Sicily and Palermo, he becomes the absolute master of the situation. King Victor Emmanuel loses almost all his prestige. To most Italians, he's simply a friend of Garibaldi. He'll probably keep his crown, but that crown will shine only with the reflected light that a heroic adventurer chooses to throw on it. So we must ensure that the Bourbon government in Naples falls before Garibaldi gets there, before he sets foot on the mainland. We must then take that government into our own hands in the name of order and humanity, while snatching from the hands of Garibaldi the supreme direction of the Italian movement." But Garibaldi crossed the States regardless on the 18th, and heedless of the grilling summer heat, led his men up towards Naples. He arrived there, rather surprisingly, by train, on a railway that had been built by King Bomba some years before, which now reached as far as the Amalfi Coast. He requisitioned all the rolling stock he could find, filled it with his army, while he himself climbed into an open carriage and advanced slowly among the dense crowds that lined the track. That evening, on the 7th of September, he addressed a cheering populace from the balcony of the Royal Palace of Naples, thanking the Neapolitans, and I quote, "in the name of all Italy, which, thanks to their cooperation, had at last become a nation." It was a shameless lie. They hadn't lifted a finger, but he doubtless felt that a little flattery at this point would do no harm. Anyway, for the next 2 months, he ruled Naples and Sicily as a dictator. But he advanced a little further, first because Cavour sent an army against him, and secondly because in October, King Victor Emmanuel himself came to take titular command. And from that moment, the old adventurer's star began to set. With the king himself on the way, he saw that his rule in the south must come to an end, and he gave in gracefully. On the 26th, he met the king at Teano, and on the 7th of November, the two of them entered Naples side by side in the royal carriage. Victor Emmanuel offered him the rank of full general, together with a splendid estate, a ship, and several other magnificent privileges, but Garibaldi would have none of them. He remained a revolutionary, and for as long as Austria still occupied Venice and the Veneto, and the Pope continued as temporal ruler in Rome, he was determined to preserve his freedom of action. So on the 9th of November, he sailed for his farm on the tiny island of Caprera off the Sardinian coast. He took with him only a little money, borrowed, since he'd made none during his months of power, a few packets of sugar and coffee and a bag of seeds for his garden. On Passion Sunday, the 17th of March, 1861, Victor Emmanuel II was proclaimed King of Italy. Old Massimo d'Azeglio, Cavour's predecessor as chief minister, is reported to have said when he heard the news, "L'Italia è fatta, restano a fare gli italiani." Italy's made, now we must make the Italians. But although the first half of the statement was true, Italy, an Italian nation, had indeed come into existence, even if it wasn't quite complete, the second half was truer still. The Bourbon King Francis II kept up his resistance. The country, or the peninsula, had been divided since the end of the Roman Empire, and few indeed of Italy's 22 million people thought of themselves as Italians. North and South had virtually nothing in common, with radically different standards of living, as indeed they still have today. New roads and railways had to be built, a national army and navy had somehow to be created, together with a new legal system, civil administration, common currency. And in the meantime, there was no alternative to the adoption of Piedmontese institutions. But this forcible Piedmontization was widely resented and obviously did little help to help the cause of unity. Even the king's decision to call himself the second caused offense. As the first king of a united Italy, surely he was Victor Emmanuel I. Was the Risorgimento really the rebirth of Italy, or was it simply the conquest of Italy by the House of Savoy? Well, less than 3 months after the royal proclamation, Cavour was dead of a massive stroke. He was just 50 years old. He had never been to Rome in his life. If he had lived just one more decade, he'd have seen the last two pieces of the Italian jigsaw, Venetia Lombardy, which included the city of Venice, and Rome itself, fitted into place. And oddly enough, the man responsible for finally fitting them was not an Italian at all. He was a Prussian, the Prussian Chancellor, Otto von Bismarck. Bismarck was also busy with reunification, the integration of all the innumerable little German states into a single empire, and Austria was getting in his way. So he forged an alliance with the new Kingdom of Italy that the two would attack Austria simultaneously on two fronts, and in the event of victory, Italy would receive Venetia Lombardy as a reward. A single battle was enough. It was fought on the 3rd of July at Sadova, some 65 miles northeast of Prague, and it engaged the greatest number of troops, some 1,300,000, ever assembled on a European battlefield. Austria was soundly defeated, and the resulting armistice duly resulted in the cessation of the promised territory. Venice was now at last an Italian city rather than an Austrian one, and Italy could boast a new and economically invaluable port on the northern Adriatic. Well, that left Rome. And Rome, too, was acquired by courtesy of Bismarck, who now cunningly drew France into what we now know as the War of 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. Till then, and for some years already, the French army had occupied Rome, protecting it and the papacy from the forces of the new Kingdom of Italy. But now suddenly, Napoleon III needed every soldier he had to fight the Prussians. Thus, by the end of August, there wasn't a single French soldier left in Rome. Pope Pius IX was left defenseless. Napoleon's defeat on the 1st of September spelled the end of the Second Empire, and on the 20th, the Italian army entered the Holy City. The Pope withdrew inside the walls of the Vatican, where he remained the last 8 years of his life. Rome was now, at last, part of Italy, under its sovereign king, Victor Emmanuel II, and finally took its place among the nations of Europe. Well, having gone so far with Garibaldi, I think I had to finish the story of the Risorgimento, even though after that thrilling beginning it didn't perhaps have all that much to do with Sicily. But now we can return there for the lovely picture I promised to finish up with. That other great Roman site, the theatre at Armerina, which the Romans built on the site of an earlier Greek one, with the snow-capped cone of Etna in the distant background. It looks glorious, doesn't it? Everybody thinks of that when they think of Sicily. But alas, all in this lovely island is not yet well. After the reunification, the Sicilians found that they hated the new Italian government even more than that of the Bourbons. They'd been refused their promised autonomy, and they deeply resented the way Garibaldi had been treated, his summary dismissal with barely a word of thanks or congratulation from the new Italian government on his astonishing achievement. And the new Italian government wasn't too keen on them either. Officials sent from Turin had expected a sadder, poorer Piedmont. Here instead was another world, speaking what was virtually another language of which they couldn't understand a word, not even sharing the moral values of the North. Nepotism, for example, wasn't considered remotely wrong. It was the duty of any respectable man to do as much as he could for his family and friends. Patronage, too, was right and natural. As to being a shirker or even a deserter, absolutely no shame was attached to that, since no one felt any loyalty to the new state. And that was why the island had developed a pseudo-government of its own, the Mafia. But the Mafia is another story, and one that we have no time for today. Mussolini largely destroyed it, sending its chiefs scurrying off to America. But the Americans sent them back to Sicily again to help them in their invasion of the island in 1943. 3 years later, in 1946, the Sicilians were at last granted a regional assembly, 85 years after Garibaldi first suggested it. And since then, their considerable degree of autonomy has probably restored much of their self-respect. But 7 centuries of poverty and subjection cannot be eliminated overnight. And there's still, I very much fear, a very long way to go. Thank you. Thank you very much.